Good afternoon. First of all, my apologies for not making a PowerPoint presentation here. Actually, I lost my pen drive in the transit, and then I realized that I'm much better off without a PowerPoint presentation. So I'll just speaking, and I'll give you all the data that I can recollect. I'll begin my talk by giving you three startling facts about India. That except for one city, none of the city has 24/7 water supply, and India is a large country. None of the city of India has complete sewage connectivity, and all rivers in North India are highly polluted. And these three things indicate certain things, that there is enormous possibility in terms of urban water regeneration, and there is immense scope for the introspection that what exactly went wrong. That leads us to understand water in the context of developing economies. Well, water has traditionally been termed as a public good, but for water to be a public good, it has to be non-rival, non-excludable good. By saying non-rival, it means that the consumption of one person should not debar the consumption of other person from that particular commodity. Non-excludable, because nobody can survive without water. But this dilemma, or this particular proposition about the water, for water to be a public good, did not hold good for a long period of time. The Western developed economy understood it much earlier. The Dublin Conference termed water to be an economic good, while the developing countries like India, and traditionally this has been deep-seated in the politics of that particular country, that water continued to be termed as a public good. As gradually it became a rival good because the growth of population, so the ultimate result was it's a common pool resource. And as you all know, that common pool resource has its own problems. The tragedy of commons, the tragedy of overuse, the tragedy of exploitation. And this is the classic case which happened with India. And I'm talking about the challenges that India has faced about the water sector as such. I'm heading one of the largest water utility in India, and probably this is the second largest water utility in the world. New Delhi caters to almost 18 million population, and it has 2.1 million water connection. Now, what is the mechanism to set things right? Traditionally, three things have been adopted by all governments and all water utilities: pricing, metering, and universal connectivity. Through pricing and metering, the factor of rivalry in the water, the consumption of water, is reduced substantially, and universal connectivity brings in a sense of equity in the society. And water, especially in the water, the equity is the paramount importance. But gradually, as it remained in the government sector, various cities had different governance structure in the water supply systems. At the very lower scale, smaller towns has government departments supplying water. In certain slightly bigger cities, you will find municipal bodies supplying water to the population. And third, at the larger scale, like New Delhi, Calcutta, Mumbai, Chennai, Bangalore, all these cities have different independent public-owned corporations. But essentially, all these water body and supply system remained in the government sector. Now we all know that if the utility function remains in the government, then it has its own pitfalls. The first pitfall is the rent-seeking behavior of the politician and the government functionary itself who's engaged in water supply. One, the unincorporated externality with the water supply itself and sanitation if the water and wastewater is not taken care of properly. Third, there is an economic term called gamekeeper poacher problem. If you yourself is responsible for supply of certain commodity and you are entrusted with the responsibility of making sure that your activity is proper, then it's a dilemma. You cannot take action against yourself. So these factors hindered the effective supply of water in various cities. Somehow, unfortunately, it could not dissociate itself with the government dominance. So, now the problem of taking it further, like taking the governance further, a suitable structure is to be found. And country has also realized that a suitable structure is to be found, as it has been found earlier. In fact, to my mind, water sector has taken the course of power sector. The liberalization of power, which happened, which is called Southern Cone model, which started in Chile and Argentina, that you have a monopoly, and monopoly has been divided into smaller entities. At the top you have the regulator, then the Genco, generation company, distribution company, and Transco, transmission company. Water sector somehow has also shaped itself in the same forum. But in all developing countries, except, I'm talking about Asia especially, except for Japan and Korea, and Phnom Penh to a certain extent, and Manila, because Manila is another case study, all the cities in South Asia and Southeast Asia have remained as a monopoly. Now, as it remained in the monopoly, it could not acquire the structure that West had developed and actually experimented successfully in the water sector. We have already heard about the English and Wales speaker regulator. The most successful privatization was obviously England and Wales. The model which talks about the monopoly, and in standard regulatory terms, you'll find municipal, it is termed as municipal hydraulic model, graduated in 1980s and 90s after Washington consensus to a term called market liberalization. So all the utilities had to find a liberalized form of deliverance. Market environmentalism had three factors. The first factor is obviously the privatization of assets. Now, two countries have successfully done it, England and Chile, and Wales obviously. Then the commercialization of environmental regulation, and third, the liberalization of governance. Peculiarly, you will find that in certain countries, especially in South Asia and especially in India, the second and third factors have been experimented slightly at different levels. But all three factors have never been incorporated and successfully adopted in the water supply, urban water supply totally. And this is the result. That is the problem that India faced. So you have at one spectrum the complete asset transfer and ownership, and live example in terms of England and Wales. Second, on second plane, you have marketization of resource and ascertaining the private ownership of different assets that Chile has experimented. The commercialization of the corporation, the entire utility that you find in Netherlands, which has done a tremendous job. Then you have, and then on the third spectrum, you have France, which outsources its water supply. South Africa, which is actually somehow implemented the total cost recovery of the water supply. Then in Canada, you have total deregulation, and Indonesia, you have decentralization model. India somehow and South Asian cities somehow found itself in second and third group, the commercialization and deregulation model as such. And as a result of that, the access of the private sector in the water supply remains slightly restricted. I'll come to the history of private sector involvement in India in a while. In 2001, 2002, the first experiment of private sector involvement in India took place. It's a place called Hubli, Dharwad, Gulbarga. It's in South India. The state is Karnataka. The company was Veolia. And it was the first experiment, and it's the most successful experiment so far. But it was done on a tiny scale in which only the distribution part, the PPP model, was experimented only in the distribution. Later, many cities experimented the same model, but somehow the regulatory framework was missing. And as a result of that, many experiments, the Salt Lake experiment, the Mysore experiment, the experiments in Madhya Pradesh, the experiment in Chandigarh, all these experiments had some problem or other. Delhi, being the largest water utility, started experimenting in 2003 and 4. But there was huge protests about introducing PPP model in water distribution sector. Well, protests are not new to water. Even in developed economy, you will find protests. There have been protests in Stockton, California itself, protests in Tucumán, Argentina. There has been protests in Bolivia, Cochabamba protest and La Paz protest. It's very, very common. India was rather circumspect right from the beginning of not handing over the asset and the source of water to the private sector. Second, the pricing was also capped right from the beginning. So the potential of pitfall, potential of faltering was very minimal right in the beginning. But unfortunately, there were certain structural problems. And all over the world, the PPP in water supply has failed because of these structural problems. Even now, all the experiments which are going on, especially in my water utility itself, we have experimented in 3 small pockets where we had invited PPP, and one of the largest companies who are involved in the water sector, Veolia, Suez and Tahal of Israel, they have won the bid. But somehow or other, we find that they have bound themselves in the financial stream in such a manner that the progress is not very, very encouraging. Now, that leads us to think that what is the problem with the private sector involvement? The problem is sevenfold. And some of the problems are not applicable to India. The first problem that you'll find the public sector, the protests. They are in water. If there are protests, politicians immediately draw back. They just do not compromise. They do not find any, because it's a good, essential good. It's a good which supports life. It's a good which can win a political party to the power, or it can remove the political party also. So there is a huge stake involved. Second, if the cities are not big enough, then obviously private sector would not be very keen to enter. But that is not the case with India. Rather, India is other way around. There's too much of population everywhere. Third factor to my mind is if the bigger cities are cherry-picked already. And invariably, this is the case, that big cities have already experimented, and if there is a failure and the people have already protested against PPP, then there is a very less likelihood that again they will experiment with the PPP. So it's a great opportunity lost for all these cities. And that's why I still harp that at least 3 pilot projects which are going on in Delhi should succeed, and should succeed successfully. Now, apart from this, the currency devaluation is another factor which bears in their mind. Fourth, the regulatory capacity and other factors, smaller factors, that how do you behave and what is the behavior with the hiring agency. These are certain factors which is very important. So the water supply system, in the end, I would, because I have only 1 minute to speak, in the end I will summarize, though I could not speak about the wastewater, which is more exciting than water supply system. If I talk about India and I talk about Indian cities, I would summarize that there is an immense potential of private sector participation in terms of upscaling the efficiency. There is no dearth of finance, to tell you. India is now 3rd largest economy in the world. But there is definitely a lack of regulatory capacity. There is definitely a lack of efficiency. There is definitely a demand for taking it from the municipal hydraulic system to a system of market environmentalism. And once it is done, gradually it is moving, but this needs to be fast forwarded. Thank you very much.